Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to finish up the cab and get going on the box. There's a good chance we'll have it complete by the end of the video. We'll start with the last couple of bits on the cab at step 59, the front bumper. For screws, all we need is 4 2x6 self-tappers. For plastic we have L2, the bumper, which I've already painted matte black. There's Q2 and Q3, the chrome light buckets, and there's K1 and K2, the lenses. There's also the footsteps, R5 and R6, but we'll get to them after the lenses go in. Now this is a very simple step of the build for the most part. All we need to do is drop the lenses into the appropriate side, pop the bucket over the top and install the 2 screws. Now it should be very straightforward, but I did eventually notice it's possible to get the buckets hung up so they don't quite sit straight. Now it only puts them a fraction out of position, but when you come to mount the bumper on the chassis it just won't quite fit. So in the next step, if anything doesn't quite go right, have a fiddle with the light buckets. Now at some point we'll either have to use the orange decal or paint the colour of the outer bit of the large lights for the indicators. We'll probably try some lens paint, but I'm sure the decals would look okay too. Now for the steps, they have a little tongue on one end that fits fairly snugly into a slot on the back of the bumper. All we need to do is apply a couple of spots of polycement in the hole and push the step in, making sure it's nice and straight. Leave it for 10 minutes for the glue to grab, and as long as you're careful we can move on to the next step. Step 60, fitting the bumper and the other bits to the cab. There's even less screws for this one, we just need 2 M3x6s. Now we've got a couple of plastic bits to mention, but first let's fit the bumper. It attaches with the 2 screws that thread into the 2 tapped holes in the steel plate. Couldn't be easier, or so I thought. This is when I found out that it just wouldn't sit right. You can see the crazy angle that it sat at as the screws start to bottom out. Now it had me puzzled for a while, but in the end, as mentioned before, it was the light buckets not quite being fully seated in the bumper. Less than a millimetre of difference, and very hard to spot just by looking at the parts. When everything's installed though, the front of the bumper should be near as making a difference straight to the front of the cab. Next is the sun visor, which is on the same tree as the windows, so it comes in this smoke grey. It's supposed to be black, so I'm just going to paint it in some Tamiya Lexan paint. Also in this step they want us to install the handles and wiper to the cab. Now these end up being glued in place, but since we haven't painted the windscreen surround yet, they're just going to have to wait. Here's the painted visor. I only painted the inside, which looks just fine. Unfortunately it isn't held on with screws, but rather there's a couple of locating pins that we're supposed to glue. I'm not a huge fan of that idea. It's going to get bumped, and if we use glue it's eventually going to take paint off. When we get to it, I think we're just going to use some good old blue tack. It will stick okay, but the visor will pop off if it needs to without causing any collateral damage. Step 61, the first bit of the box. We need 4 M2x5 screws, the plastic bit H6 that bridges over the gearbox, and we need the 2 short aluminium extrusions. Now these ones are easy to find, but later in the build when we're working with the bigger bits, they can be a bit tricky to identify. With these bits, all we need to do is screw the plastic bit to the metal bits. Now you can't really get it wrong. The 2 holes at the end of the plastic match up with the 2 holes at one end of the metal bits. Simple. Okay, step 62, the corner bits. For screws we need 8 3x10 self-tappers, and for plastic we need 8 X6s, 4 X3s and 4 X2s. Making up one of the parts, we pop one of the X2s or X3s into an X6 and install a screw. Easy enough. One of the corner parts and an X3 makes up an A assembly, and one of the corner parts and an X2 makes a B assembly. We need 4 of each, which is a lot of fun. Okay, step 63, the box bottom. This one's a bit of a monster step. For screws there's 8 3x12 self-tappers, 10 M3 flange nuts, 10 M3x8s, 8 M3x12s, 8 M2 plain nuts, 8 M2x5s and 4 2x8 self-tappers, and also hiding at the bottom corner of the diagram are 2 M3x6s. Right, the extrusions. Now Tamiya have helpfully used different colour tape for the different types. but in the manual they're called by letter, so A, B, C and so on, which isn't so useful. The one that's on its own has 2 offset holes on one side. That's where the support for the whip antenna mounts, so that's the front top one, which is B. The ones with the red tape have extra holes for the door hinges, which makes them E's. The yellow ones only have the holes at the ends, which makes them the front uprights, so they're C's. That just leaves the blue, which must be the ones above and below the door, D. For this step we need one of the D's, the one with the blue tape. Now all of this does of course depend on Tamiya using the same colour tape in all the kits. They probably do, but it's still a good idea to check to make sure. Now you might be wondering where the A extrusions are. Well, they're the long ones that go front to back. All 4 are the same, and for this step we need 2. For plastic we need 6 X5s. Now you might get away without them if you don't want to fit the false floor in a couple of steps, but they will add a lot of stiffness to the box. There's also the side rails, S3s and S4s, along with the metal brackets, but we'll sort those out once the first part of the assembly is complete. That just leaves the floor panel itself. Now it's rather nicely cut from aluminium, no major sharp edges and swarf, great quality. All we need to do to get it ready is peel off the protective film. Yep, anyway, less said about that the better I think. Most of the plastic bits fit the same as each other, all but one of them used M3x8s and flange nuts. The frontmost one, the one that fits at the end with a big notch, uses the M3x6s threaded straight into the aluminium sheet. As usual, as long as you double check things as you go, it's easy enough to keep track of. Next up we need to use the extrusions and the plastic corners to make up the frame around the plate. It's all straightforward. The only bit to be careful with is that you get the A and the B corner bits in the right places. It's all clear on the diagram which is which, just make sure you check as you go. The corner bits really nicely slide into the ends of the extrusions, and the screws that are on show are a rather nice chrome. Until we get the frame put together around the plate, we'll leave all these screws just a little bit loose so we can move the bits around without stressing anything. Once it's all framed up, squeeze up the corner bits and nip up the screws. When done, you should end up with a very sturdy feeling base for the box. Very nice. The second part of this step is fitting the side rails. We'll need 2 S3s and 2 S4s. The only difference is the S4s have 2 little holes on the inside to mount plastic widgets that interlock with the battery tray on the chassis. The widgets being S1s, of which we need 2. Before we fit the rails, we'll fit the widgets with the 2x8 self-tappers. Just make sure that you make a left one and a right one. To attach them to the chassis, we've got these 4 stays. They just mount to the metal plates with 2 M2x5s from the bottom and M2 nuts on the top. Fit all 4 of them, but don't worry about doing the nuts up all the way just yet. They're going to be a bit prone to vibration, so to make sure the nuts don't fall off, we're going to use some thread lock. From the top side, all we do is use a cocktail stick to apply a little bit of liquid thread lock to the end of the screw threads. Then, to get the thread lock down inside the nuts, we just need to loosen the screws a couple of turns while holding the nuts, then retighten. Don't worry too much about getting the stays perfectly square and straight. The rails are plastic, so they'll take up any misalignment. If you fit aluminium rails though, you might want to be a bit more careful. To fit the rails, they just offer up to the stays, get an M3x12 in the end holes that thread directly into the stays. Fit all 4 rails, and that's step 63 complete. Step 64, the roof. This one shares a fair bit with 63, so it should be fairly quick to go through. We'll need 8 of those nice 3x8 self-tappers and 2 M2x5s. There's the end B and D extrusions and A's for the sides. The 2 M2 screws are for attaching a little hoop that supports the metal whip antenna, but since we're not using it, we don't need the support. However, so we don't have the 2 screw holes visible, we will pop the screws straight in on their own. I think it just looks a little bit neater. The roof panel itself is plastic. Now it doesn't matter which way round it goes, so it's just a case of using the corner bits, just like the base plate, with the self-tappers to make up the frame. Exactly the same method, and when it's done, it should look something like this. Very nice. Step 65, attaching the base plate to the chassis and fitting the uprights. This time we need 4 3x12 self-tappers, 4 M3x8s and 4 3x8 self-tappers. We also need the last of the extrusions, 2 E's and 2 C's. For starters, we'll fit the uprights to the box base. It's a good idea to do it now, as with the front ones the screws are going to be rather difficult to get to once the base is fitted to the chassis. The extrusions just slot into the plastic corners, and we use one of the 3x12 self-tappers just like before. Next, we've got something that's not in the manual. The metal plate surrounds the area where the electronics live, and the wires dive under the plate. So just in case there's any rubbing, we're going to wrap some electrical tape around the edges of the plate where the wires go. It's a simple thing, but it is going to help a little bit in the long run. To fit the box base to the chassis, we need to line it up over the mounts we fitted to the chassis a little while ago. There's holes in the plate that we need to have over the centre holes. It's made easier by the plate being a good fit around the electronics area. As long as it's sitting evenly all the way round, the holes shouldn't be too far out. Screw in the 4 M3x8s. Remember, we're threading into the brass inserts, so we can nip them up fairly tight without worrying about stripping plastic. The last 4 screws, the 3x8 self-tappers, go in around the electronics area and thread into plastic. So they don't need to be all that tight, as they're not really doing much. Just bottom them out and they'll do what they need to. Now there is another part to this step. The kit includes a plastic plate to make a false floor. Handy if you want to carry an actual load in the box, but for me it's more useful having the free space for the electronics. It's up to you what you do. Step 66, the metal strip on one of the doors. We need 4 M2x4s, 4 M2 nuts and a steel strip. For plastic, all we need is the door with the extra holes along one edge. All we do then is offer up the strip to the door and install the screws and the nuts. Just make sure the side of the door with the dimples around the big hole is on the same side as the strip. Step 67 just shows us where the include decals go on the door, which we're not going to be fitting, so we can move straight on to step 68, which has us stick the decals on the side panels. Which we're not going to do, but we are going to need to peel off the plastic protection. No, we're not doing that again. Right, step 69, fitting the panels and the roof. For this one, we need 4 3x12 self-tappers, the panels, and the truck. We've got the front panel first, which just slides into the slot in the extrusions. Same goes for the side panels, and they do fit rather nicely, almost like they're made for it. Next, the roof can go on, and the end with the 2 M3 holes near the middle goes at the back. You shouldn't need to force anything, but you might need to jiggle things around a bit to get things to settle into place. Now you can just pop the self-tappers in while lightly pressing the roof down. It doesn't need much pressure, just enough to take up the slack. Fit the 2 at the front and the 2 at the back, and that's the box mostly complete. It's just the doors to go. Step 70, another one of those super quick steps. We need the 4 rods for the doors and 8 X9s. All we do is slide 2 X9s on each of the rods, and that's it really. Step 71, building up the doors. We need 4 hinges, 2 3x12 self-tappers, 16 M2x4s, 24 M2 nuts, and 3 M2x5s. For plastic, there's the 2 doors, 2 X7s and 2 X10s that make up the locks. There's also a pair of X1s that space the hinges off from the doors. From the outside of the door, we need to pop in one of the X10s so the nubs can grab in the dimples. On the back, we slide on one of the X7s. Now to hold it all together, we use one of the self-tappers. Now it's a bit tricky to hold while doing a screw up, but Tamiya thought of that. The X7s have a hex shape, so you can use the cross wrench. The parts are all accurately sized, so we can do the screw up nice and snug, and it will be good to go. Rods next, and they're not difficult to install, but they are a bit time consuming. The plastic bits on the rods line up over the holes in the doors and get held on with the M2x4s and M2 nuts. After installing both rods, all we need to do is install the hinges. Now this is where the X1 hinge spacers come in. They fit between the hinge plates and the door. To attach them, we use the M2x5s and M2 nuts. Don't do them up tight just yet though, just take up the slack. Do the same with the other door and they're ready to fit. Step 72, fitting the doors. We need 12 M2x5s and a pair of X8s, the bits that the rods lock into. All we do is offer up a door to the back of the box and start installing screws, keeping in mind that the left door is the one without the metal strip. Fit both the doors, again just take up the slack of the screws until they're all in. Then open up the doors to 90 degrees, which will for the most part align the hinges. While the doors are still at 90 degrees, nip up all the hinge screws. The ones on the doors will of course need the cross wrench on the nuts. That just leaves the bits that the rods lock into, and if you have the rods in the lock position with the lock vertical, you can just pop the plastic bits over the end of the rods and install the screws. Once both of the bits that the rods lock into are fitted, you should be able to lock, unlock, open and close the doors. So that's the last step of the build. The manual has been completed. Yet another great Tamiya kit. There's one more little thing to do though. Now I'm not planning to use the battery mount that's under the chassis. Instead I'm mounting the battery in the back of the box. I could just leave it loose, but that's a little bit untidy. Instead I've 3D printed a battery tray. Now it's a very tight fit between the last two of the plastic bits on the box floor. The screws need loosening so we can squeeze it in. Then we just retighten the screws and it'll get itself nicely clamped. If I remember it, there should be a Thingiverse link in the description. If there isn't, point it out in a friendly, preferably non-sarcastic manner in the comments. And since that's the end of the build, I'll leave it with this photo of the truck on its first outing. Ignore the lights, they were bodged the evening before. We'll install some fancy electronics in the next video or maybe the one after. So there we go then, build complete. Bring on the mods. As always then, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a message if you've got something to say. Bye guys!